Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is December the 6th, 2021. And this, of course, is a West Shore Photography Club meeting. I'm your host, Dennis Baker, and president of the club. Thanks for joining us this evening. I apologize for the problem with the link. Copy and paste doesn't always work, so you got to be careful about that. I'm eager to talk to you tonight about my trip out west in May and share with you some of the lessons that I learned. But before we do, let's talk about a few other things. Next Monday night, December the 13th, we have a competition. There is no theme, and the esteemed Bryson Leidick will be the judge. Now, an image review is designed for you to get somebody's opinion, and you could throw almost anything out there just to see what they have to say. Competition's a little different. So the philosophy behind the competition is that it's your best work. So we would like you to go through your image files, pick out what you consider to be one of your best recent images, and submit that by midnight or before midnight Thursday. That, of course, is the deadline. All right. So image for competition. If you have questions about the guidelines, they'll be included in the follow-up email tomorrow morning. If you're not sure about uploading an image, that will also be included. A link to a document will be included in that email also. So competition, that's we only have a few of those a year, I think 3. So this one comes up next Monday. Okay, let's turn it over to Joe to talk about trips past and present.
Okay, if we may start. Elaine, can you give us an update on the trip last night to Willing Springs Children's Lake?
Certainly. I actually got there a few minutes late, so I can't really say for sure how many people were there because we dispersed very shortly after I arrived at the group. I think Eve said on Facebook that there were about 9. It looked like a little more than that to me. I think a few came after I did. The weather was cold and the sky was a little ominous when we got there, so we were concerned that we wouldn't have any great opportunities for the blue light hour. But as I was shooting on the other end of the lake, all of a sudden this beautiful pink cloud just appeared out of nowhere, and it turned out just being a fabulous night for photography, for night photography. The ceremony was canceled due to some what they quoted as unreasonable COVID restrictions. So there was no ceremony, but there were still quite a few people, but I suspect not as many as there would have been. So in a way, that was a good thing because we didn't have a lot of people that were obstructive, if you will, although there were a lot of cars, so it was difficult to photograph the lake with a lot of headlights. Nonetheless, I think many of us got some good shots. It was a good experience. And it was absolutely beautiful.
Okay, thank you. From what I saw on Facebook, the images were really kind of spectacular. It was really a cool night. You captured that blue hour just perfect, you know. So we have a trip coming up this coming Saturday on the 11th from about 10 to about 11, maybe 11:30. This is part, and it's going to be the Sheepford Bridge Road in Lower Allen Township. It's one of the historic locations within the West Shore Historical Society's jurisdictional area, I'll call it that. And it has quite historical property. So we're going to have a trip there. It's going to start at 10 o'clock, and we're going to have coffee and donuts, and that's courtesy of the West Shore Historical Society. And the partnering of us with them is to photograph these sites, and then there will be in March a month-long display of the images that you take and have framed and submit for sale at the Art Center School and Galleries. Plus there'll be an opening reception, and then throughout the month we'll have some programs on various photography topics as well as historical topics within the West Shore Photography Club area. So you're going to get an email tomorrow, and it's going to give you the address as to where we're going to park. And then we'll photograph the bridge, and there'll be some of us there to help out on Saturday at around 10 o'clock. And after that, we're then going to go to a old barn, and this is a really old barn, and it's really cool looking, but you dare not go inside because you probably won't come out. It's that bad, but that's what makes it so cool. And we're going to be photographing that, and we've made arrangements for that particular location. And there's some other things that we're going to photograph, and you'll get a map on Saturday for that. So that's Saturday at 10 o'clock in Lower Allen Township, and the address will be on the email that you get for tomorrow. And that is the announcement from the trips committee from right now.
Very good. Thanks, Joe. Okay, we have 45 people online, and according to my panel here, we have 31 people who have responded to the poll. So there are 14 people. Let me address this to those 14 people. Would you go to probably the bottom of your screen, find the little tab that says poll, P-O-L-L, and respond to the 10 yes or no questions that are there, and then hit the submit button. Okay, that'll help me during the presentation. Okay, guys, good evening. Thanks for joining. And I'm excited to share with you some things that I learned during my trip out west in May. My wife and I took a car trip, drove 6,300 miles in 28 days, and visited places we'd never seen before, like the Grand Canyon, Bryce Canyon, Zion, and many, many others. I think there were more than a dozen national parks and monuments. I would say 90% of the time I was photographing in harsh light, the middle of the day. For the most part, I wasn't there at the best times to photograph. There were a couple of days when it was cloudy and rainy. That was mostly early in the trip. But like I say, most of it was in harsh light. So I was doing a lot of thinking about how to capture decent images. Sometimes, well, hope to get better than just decent, but how to get good images in harsh light. And I practiced a few techniques that maybe I hadn't used much in the past. And when I came back, I thought about this, and I thought, just like a travel log presentation would not cut it for a photography club. It'd have to have a little more substance to it. And I thought, what was the overriding theme for me? And it was harsh light. How to deal with the harsh light and how to get some decent results. So let's take a look at that. Here's what I hope to address tonight. And I don't think we're going to have time for all of this. So if you want to continue, if we don't get to all of it, I'd be happy to continue at some later point. But let's start out by talking about the characteristics of light in general. So we have a basis for this, what we call harsh light. And we'll talk specifically then about what the characteristics are for harsh light. So we'll have a definition, more or less, a working definition of harsh light. Then we'll talk briefly about how much control we have over those characteristics. And then we get into the meat of the program, the tips I have for you for dealing with and photographing in harsh light. And then if we have time, some tips for processing your images in the software. And I use, of course, Lightroom Classic and Photoshop. So that's what I'll be talking about. But these principles would apply no matter what software you use. So characteristics of light: 4, direction, intensity, quality, and color. Now, they're mostly self-explanatory, right? Except quality. That's a little iffy. You might be wondering, well, what do I mean by the quality? Well, the quality is the harshness that I'm referring to, or the softness of the light. So if you have a very cloudy day, the light is very soft. It's diffuse. If you don't have any clouds and it's a bright sunny day, then you have what we call harsh light. You have dark shadows and bright highlights with a sharp transition zone. Okay, so let's look specifically at those characteristics. Harsh light, usually we're talking about midday, so it's coming down from overhead, usually creating, if you're taking a picture of a person, you get some unflattering shadows under the eye sockets, under the nose, under the chin, very dark areas that usually don't look very flattering. So it's usually coming from above in terms of direction. Intensity, yeah, it's bright, very simply. Quality, like we say, that's why we call it harsh. The light has some very dark shadows and some very bright highlights. And that's what we call high dynamic range, because the difference in light intensity between the darkest parts of the scene and the brightest parts of the scene is very great, often greater, now not greater than what our eyes can see, because our eyes are amazing and we pick up detail in the shadow areas and detail in the highlights, even on a bright sunny day. But when it comes to your camera, it's a little different story, because your sensor and the files that it's recording to they don't have as large a dynamic range. So you have trouble capturing detail either in the shadow areas or in the highlight areas, or in some cases, both, right? So we're dealing with a situation of high dynamic range, very sharp shadows, very dark areas, very bright areas. And for the color, well, you find that when you look at the color of light, that during the midday, it sort of has a whitish, bluish tinge to it. As you get more towards sunrise or sunset, of course, then you get the orange, reddish tones that are typical of sunrise and sunset. How much control do you have? Well, it depends. With the direction, you can't control the direction the light's coming from above. It's coming from the sun. But you can take advantage of light that is reflected. Okay, and we'll talk more about that. But reflecting that light does a few good things for us. Okay, it helps us photographically, and I'll speak more specifically to that in a moment. The intensity, that's not a problem. Okay, so much, just the plain bright light, because if you get a proper, capture, you simply take the intensity slider, in Lightroom or whatever, and you lower the intensity. So as long as you capture that detail, you can control the intensity or the brightness of the light in what you've captured, in the photograph. Now, the quality, that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about. What can you do to enhance the quality of the light or to make it look less harsh? And the color, well, if you're shooting in JPEG, you don't have a lot of control over that. Okay. You really have to set the white balance in the camera to be consistent with the light, that the ambient light that exists. So if it's a bright sunny day, you set the white balance to bright sunny. If it's a cloudy day, you set it to cloudy. Okay. But one of the advantages of shooting in RAW format is that you don't have to worry so much about that, because you can change it in post. So if you get bluish, harsh light in midday and you want to warm it up a little bit in post, white balance slider will take care of that for you. Not a problem if you're shooting RAW. But as I say, if you're shooting JPEG, you almost have to set that white balance in the camera to be consistent with the color of the light from the ambient light. If you don't have much flexibility in changing the color tone of that light. Okay, my tips for photographing in harsh light. Well, the number one tip is don't. Yes, I know. Yeah, if you can avoid it, do that. Let me go through a couple examples of what I mean. Don't shoot in harsh light. Shoot sunrise or sunset. And if you're much of a landscape photographer, that's a mantra of yours. Okay, that's just the way landscape photographers work. But here's an example of the Grand Canyon. On the left, I shot it at 11:10 a.m. Oh, the colors were just terrible. The lighting was harsh and it just doesn't look good at all. But when I went back then that evening and shot at 6:49 p.m. when the sun was setting, oh my goodness, look at the shadows, the highlights and the shadows. The light's softer. You get shadows that define the shape of the canyon edges, ridges, and the color it brings out in the stone just does not show up in midday. Okay. So if you can, shoot sunrise, sunset, or a cloudy day. Okay. On the left, Deadwood, the parade, it was a very overcast day and you get nice, even lighting. Okay. Well, in fact, it's so even that sometimes you get what we call muddy light. It just doesn't define the characteristics of like a face. So what I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, but what I typically do in post then is I'll take a radial filter and brighten the woman's face. So I I go up here with the radial filter in Lightroom and develop module, just put a radial filter over her and just brighten it up a little bit. Okay. Just to give it some, make it stand out, give it some detail, because things blend in too much. If it's too cloudy, there's not enough to differentiate the features. Now, down here on the lower right at Mount Rushmore, it was a bright sunny day. And if you look at the girls' faces, you can see the effect. The harsh shadows, not very complimentary. Okay. So I did that, what choice did I have? There's not much I could do at this point. I could have turned them around with their backs to the sun, but you sort of have to, I wanted to face Mount Rushmore, so kind of stuck with that. So you don't get the most flattering look on the girls because of the harsh light. Not a whole lot you can do sometimes in a situation like that. Look for reflected light. I mentioned this earlier. In the canyon walls, like here at Bryce, the red rock was just beautiful. And as that sunlight from high above comes down and bounces off the canyon walls and picks up that color, that red color, it just glows. I mean, the whole thing was just beautiful. So it helped in a number of ways. It redirected the light so it wasn't coming down from just overhead, and it picked up the color. So it helped in two respects: color, direction, and actually quality too, because when the light comes straight on and hits, you get very harsh shadows. You get very strong shadows with a strong transition between the two, a short transition. But when it bounces off the walls, it diffuses and comes from all directions and gives you a much more even light. So you look at the canyon floor, evenly lit, because it's not being struck by the direct sunlight. Now, the problem you do run into, or I ran into here, is back here. See, this bright sky area was a problem, and I dealt with that in a different way, which I'll explain later. Okay. But looking for reflected light, or if you're in a situation between two buildings, like you're in a city and you have two large buildings, if you shoot the reflected, don't shoot directly at the sun or the sky. Look for things that are illuminated by the reflected light. It'll be softer, coming from a better angle, and might pick up some color like the light did here. Oh, by the way, I'll certainly be glad to entertain your questions. I don't want to use chat this evening. Let's make it a little more informal than that. I'll take a break here in a little, well, every so often, and ask you to entertain or to raise your questions. You can simply unmute yourself and fire away with questions. If you're taking a picture of someone or something that you can move, like my wife, I just ask her, this is one of the cliff dwellings, and she's in the shade. Okay, not in the direct sunlight. So I'm getting the advantage of reflected light and the color from the stone, being picked up, and the diffuseness of that reflected light. And you get a much more flattering light, on your subject. Now, again, I ran into a problem back here that I didn't deal with in this particular picture. See, this area is overexposed by the direct sunlight back here. And I could have cropped that out, but I just dealt with it. I just left it overexposed at this point. I wanted the sidewalk in there and the composition to flow in a more horizontal fashion, but that is overexposed. Now, the one problem you typically run into in a situation like this is there's light from the blue sky, okay, is illuminating the underside of that cave. That will throw in a blue tint. And if you're not careful, if you don't correct for that, then your picture is going to look like it did down here on the lower right. See the bluish green tinge to that? Okay, that's from the light from the clear sky. So just left to its own, when I imported this image into Lightroom, it just accepted what the white balance that the camera had set. Even though I shot raw, it accepted what the camera had set for the white balance, and it came up looking like the picture on the lower right, the version on the lower right. So I simply moved the white balance slider to the right a little bit to warm up the image and make it look, more palatable, okay, more pleasant. A little change in the white balance there in post is appropriate there to get rid of that greenish blue tint. Okay, so in all of the cases I just discussed, the light was improved for our photography through all of these things that happened. Number one, the direction changed because light wasn't coming from directly overhead. It was reflected in some manner. Number two, it became less intense. But number three, really important, is it became diffused. It wasn't shining directly on my subject, but it was bouncing around and lighting up the entire scene more uniformly. Okay, so that the shadows weren't as dark and the highlights weren't as bright. It reduced the dynamic range of the light in the scene. Okay, harsh light, high dynamic range. A lot of difference between the intensity of the dark areas and the brightest areas. Great range there. But in the reflected situation, like the cave, that's all been reduced. So now the dark areas aren't as dark and the bright areas aren't as bright. And the sensor, the camera, and the file that you're using to save it do a better job of recording the information that's there. They're able to handle that limited range. And of course, the light being warmer just makes it look more pleasant. Right? Now, the other approach you can take is, hey, I'm going to grab this tiger by the tail and I'm going to take advantage of the situation. I've got harsh light. What's it do? Oh, it creates really dark shadows. Great. Let's take pictures of dark shadows. So look for those sorts of things. And then, expose correctly, of course, to emphasize the dark shadows. And then there's things you can do in post to bring those out too, but take advantage of the situation. Or take advantage of it this way with a sun flare. And as most of you know, all you have to do there is set your aperture at something small, like f16. Boom. The physics of the situation, gives you the sunburst. Now, it helps for the sunburst to show up if you just move your camera a little bit, get in the shadow of the cliff here, or a statue, or whatever it is that you're photographing. I look for the shadow, and then I position myself so I'm in the shadow, and then I just go move my body and the camera a little bit so the sun pokes out a little bit. And of course, the reason it shows up so well is that the spikes are in front of the dark canyon wall. So those spikes really show up. If I didn't do that and the sun were just out here, then the spikes would not be as obvious. See, they'd look like they do here. But down here, wow, really impressive. So I actually did a lot of this. And the one thing I found out was that the sunbursts look very different depending on the particular lens that you use. So you might have one lens and let's say you use f16 with both lenses, but the sunbursts might look very different. I had a 24-70 lens, L series Canon, and a 16, I'm sorry, it was a 70-200 Canon L series lens and a 16-35 Canon L series lens. This is the 16-35, and it does a great job, creating sunbursts. So again, taking advantage of the situation and shooting sunbursts and shadows. Now, let's get to the meat of the program. There are times when you want pictures and you're shooting in harsh light. So the biggest thing I can tell you is that the biggest advantage you have is to shoot raw. Now, and you've heard this before, and I can see from the results of the poll, and let's see, 41 people. Okay, there's only 11. We picked up, we're at 52 now. So 11 people haven't responded yet. So you 11, if you still want to participate, I have there are 9 other questions. Just respond to those in the poll. But what do we got here? We got 35 out of 41 said that you predominantly shoot in raw format. That's excellent. That's excellent. That will help you a lot in every situation, but emphatically when you're shooting in harsh light. And here's why. Okay, there's at least 3 reasons why raw files are much, much better when you're shooting in harsh light. Number 1, raw files have a greater dynamic range. Remember I talked about the dynamic range of harsh light, very dark shadows, and then very bright brights, highlights. Okay, raw files are able to accommodate that much better than JPEG files. Okay, still not as good as our eyes. Okay, but much better than JPEG files. Okay, JPEGs are very limited in the dynamic range, so it's very easy to lose the detail in the shadows or the highlights or both. Okay, but raw files, much greater dynamic range. Bit depth. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the term bit depth. Computer people are, but raw files have a much greater bit depth. And that means that they can capture more detail. And in the photograph, that equates to more tones or more shades in the picture. A JPEG file only allows you to capture 256 different shades or tones. And what often happens, or sometimes happens, is like in the picture here that I'm showing of the sky and the hot air balloon, you notice that the lines in the picture, that's referred to as banding. And that's a result of the limited number of shades that the JPEG file can display. Okay? That is much, much less likely or not going to happen with a RAW file, because it can display many, many more shades, and there's a more gradual change in the tones as the sky goes from light down here on the horizon to darker up in the sky. Okay. You also notice that in like facial tones, if you're shooting portraits, you might find that when you shoot JPEG, you'll see blotchiness on somebody's cheeks. And it's because of the limited number of tones that the file can record and reproduce. If you're shooting 14-bit RAW files, they have 16,384 shades theoretically that they can reproduce, as compared to the 256 shades of a JPEG file. So you're not going to get the banding when you shoot RAW files like you might get with the JPEG. Another good reason to shoot RAW, especially when you're shooting in harsh light. Okay, and I'm going to ask for questions here in just a minute if anybody has any. The other advantage, number 3, RAW files are not compressed the same way that JPEG files are. So JPEG files, basically, the algorithms in the camera process the JPEG file, keep a limited amount of data, not nearly as many shades, not as much information, and discard the rest. And the files are compressed so they don't take up as much space. So you lose a lot of information in that compression. Okay, also in the capture because of the limited bit depth, but also in the compression process. Okay, it's trying to make a smaller file so it gets rid of what it considers to be unnecessary information, but what might be important to us as photographers. RAW files don't get rid of nearly as much information. They keep it and send it to you, and then they say, here you go. Now it's your job to process those files. But shooting RAW is probably the number one thing that I would recommend. It has more advantages than any of the other tips that I have to offer. Okay, let's take a short break here. Anybody have any questions at this point? Just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Dennis, I have a question. This is
Yes,
Elaine.
Elaine.
When you are shooting into the sun to get that starburst effect,
Yes.
how do you prevent the sun flares?
How do you present them, or how do you create them?
No, how do you prevent the sun flare?
Prevent.
Yes.
You don't. Number one, well, there are a couple things you can do. Number one, make sure the front element of your lens is clean. Okay. Don't have any smudges or dirt on the front element. That'll tend to give rise to the flare, those big blobs of color that you sometimes get. The other thing is don't use any filters on the front of the lens. If you want to get a good clean sunburst without the blobs of color that we call lens flare, if you have a UV filter on, take it off. In fact, most of the research that I've read says UV filters are not necessary. Okay, I know you're saying, well, I want one to protect the front end of my lens. For the most part, you don't need it. And it just introduces another piece of glass, which can give rise to lens flare and other, artifacts and distractions and problems, dust and all that sort of stuff. A polarizer, well, we're going to talk a little bit about polarizing filters, but if you have a polarizing filter on and you're shooting into the sun like this, take it off. Okay, it's not going to do anything for you except cause lens flare. So the other thing is the quality of the lens. If you use a kit lens, even if it's clean and there are no filters on it, you're more likely to get not only the sun, well, you get a sunburst of some effect. It might not be nice and clean like that with the spikes, but you're more likely to get the big blobs of color than two that come down, through the picture. If you use a high quality glass, like an L series lens for Canon, less likely to get the flare. Yeah, that help, Elaine?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Anybody else?
Yes, Dennis, Jan Williams. I'm curious about the in the cave shot with, I think, your wife.
Oh, okay.
Yes. To your eye, when you looked at this picture, was it more like the picture you shopped or the picture you took?
Interesting question. Scientific experiments have shown that our human eyes and brains do a great deal of accommodating. That means we sort of adjust. Like when you walk into a room with incandescent lights, I know they're going out of style, but the old incandescent lights have a very orangish glow to them. If you're outside, if I'm outside at night and walking and I walk around the street and I look in a room in a house that has incandescent lights, it looks very orange. And then I see a bulb, I see a house that's very white inside, and I know, well, that's probably an LED bulb. Okay. They have very different colors, but we don't often notice them. In a situation like that, where I'm outside walking and I see a lot of dark, and then I see, then it's more noticeable. But if you're in a situation like that, your eyes and your brain sort of think, oh, that looks natural. And you don't think to change, like if you're shooting raw, you don't think to change the white balance because it looks okay to you. But when the image is captured on your sensor and in the file, it's a different story. It records the actual color of the light as it exists, not as your brain interpreted it. So yes, you're very often going to get a mismatch in that case. And that's another good reason for shooting raw. I tell my students in class that one of the big reasons I shoot raw is because it makes my life easier when I'm shooting. I don't have to make a lot of decisions. I don't have to decide to shoot, to pick a white balance. I do that in post. I don't have to worry about picture styles, which are setting the saturation and the color and in the camera. Okay. I do that in post. So I just delay my decision-making till later. I don't let the camera do it for me. And if I let the camera do it and shoot JPEG, if I don't make some adjustments, it's going to make the wrong decisions. It's not going to come out right. It won't look good. But the answer to the question is, you don't notice it for the most part, but you will in the picture. It's kind of like shadows. You can look at a scene and, hey, it looks fine. And you take a picture and you notice the shadow of this pole right across your subject's face. And you go, whoa, where did that come from? Okay. And your eyes and brain accommodated for it. It was there. And if you look then after you saw it in the picture and you look very carefully at the person, you'll say, oh yeah, now I see it. But you didn't before because it just wasn't that obvious. Does that help, Jan?
Yes, thanks.
Sure. Anybody else?
Dennis, I have a question for you. Were you
Yes,
tempted at all? Were you tempted at all to photograph in black, right on that shot you were there, just the one you just had with the graphic elements? Were you tempted at all to photograph in black and white in the harsh shadows at all?
No, I never I always shoot raw, and you can, I don't do this. You can set the camera in picture styles to display the image in black and white, even if you shoot raw. And if you're a serious black and white shooter, you probably want to do that because it helps you visualize, you know, the image afterwards. And I don't know about you, but for some reason, things look different in the back of the camera than they do when I look at them with my eyes. I look at a scene and I take a picture and I look at the back of the camera, whether it's in black and white or color, and I go, oh, wow, I better redo that picture. You know, it just looks different. So if you set in picture styles to show you a black and white image and you shoot in RAW, you'll see black and white on the back of the camera, but the RAW file will still have all the color information. And then when you go into post, like in Lightroom, it'll show you the color version. And of course you can convert it to black and white, you know, if you want, as I did. Oh no, I was going to say I converted this. I didn't. That's a color image. See the blue?
Mhm.
Yeah. So no, I never do it in the camera. I never shoot as to capture it as a black and white image. I always capture it as a color. So I have that information with the option of converting it later if I want to.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody else?
Along with that, shooting in black and white and in color, and converting to black and white in Lightroom, a lot of times I play with the different color channels, such as red and blue and yellow and green, to change the way the black and white looks.
Absolutely. Yeah, I highly recommend that. And I won't be getting into that tonight, but that's a good suggestion. Okay. Any other questions before I motor on?
What about using a neutral density filter? Does that do anything for harsh light?
No. If it's a uniform neutral density filter, the only thing it does is reduce the overall amount of light entering the camera evenly across the scene. However, if you go with a graduated neutral density filter, yes, that can be very effective, because let's say you have a landscape shot and you have a bright sky. So if you put the darker part of the graduated neutral density filter over the sky, it's going to block some of that light. Okay. What you're effectively doing is reducing the dynamic range of the scene, because down here in the landscape, you have the darkest darks. Up here in the sky, you have the brightest brights. Well, if you can tone down the sky and you know, absorb some of that light in it so it's not so bright, then you don't have the great range in tones that you did before. So a graduated neutral density filter, yes, is highly recommended. And you know, where's my pen? I think that's something I forgot to include in the program. So when I revise it, I will add that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Dennis, do you ever use a graduated neutral density filter ever?
No, that's another good question. With the advent of digital, that used to be every landscape photographer owned graduated neutral density filters and used them religiously pre-digital. Some still do. I don't own one, and therefore I don't use one, because I do it in post. So I shoot raw, okay, and then if the sky's too bright, hopefully I was able with the raw file, I'm able to capture the entire dynamic range of the scene and not blow out the sky. And then when I get into post, okay, use the graduated filter in the develop module of Lightroom. If I do blow out the sky, guess what my resolution to that problem is?
Change it.
Replace the sky. Right. If you do. Okay. So dynamic raw files. Okay. So we said, yes, that's impressive. Most of you are shooting 38 out of 44, 86% are shooting in raw format. So good for you. The other biggie, keep your ISO as low as you can. Now, don't go into those. If your camera has those artificial low, like 50, 25, don't go with that. Research your camera and go with what they call the native ISO. Most cameras, it's 100. Some cameras, it's 200. Okay. But go with the native ISO, native ISO. What that does is it maintains the highest dynamic range for the file, because you're hearing a consistent theme here. The problem with shooting in harsh light is it has a large dynamic range, exceeding the capability of the camera and your file. Well, if you shoot raw and you shoot at ISO 100, the native ISO, you're capturing as much of that dynamic range that's in the scene as is possible. I didn't say all of it. We'll get to that in a minute. I said as much as possible. All right. Tip number 5, don't blow out the highlights. That's a biggie. Shoot for the highlights. You old slide film shooters. Okay. It's the old adage when we were shooting slides, don't overexpose the highlights. Well, the same is true for digital files. The dark areas, yeah, you can deal with those. You can bring up the shadows in Lightroom or your software, whatever you use. But if you blow out the highlights, it doesn't matter if you're shooting RAW or JPEG. If you blow out the highlights, you have lost any detail in that part of the image. It's gone. You can't recover it. Now, you might be fooled a little bit. Okay. Our cameras have ways of fooling us. When you look at the preview on the back of your camera, you're not looking at the raw file. You can't see a raw file. Raw file is just data. It needs to be processed. You're looking at a JPEG copy of the raw file, an estimation. Your camera's saying, oh, here, this is approximately what your file's going to look like, your photo. It's not the actual file. So where it can fool you is, it's a JPEG, and the JPEG has a limited dynamic range, smaller than the raw file. So it can say, oh, you've overexposed certain areas of the picture. Well, maybe not. In the JPEG, it might be overexposed. You might find that when you take the raw file into Lightroom, you just bring the highlight slider down to the left and you're good to go. You've recovered the highlights. But you have to be careful about that. Maybe it's fooling you and maybe it isn't. When your camera says, when those blinkies go off and your camera says, oh, highlight alert, you've overexposed the file, your best bet is to take another shot and underexpose, lower the exposure, I should say. Okay. Now, we don't want to blow out the highlights, but that doesn't mean that you just want to inadvertently shoot underexposed all the time. Okay. Let's say you're shooting raw and you get this image and you look at it in the back of your camera and you go, that looks terrible. I better shoot it again. It's overexposed. Well, guess what? If you check the histogram, you'll find out it's not overexposed. Here's the histogram. It's not bunched up on the right-hand side. What I've done with this image is I've captured the maximum, pretty much the maximum amount of detail, because the detail in an image resides predominantly at the upper end of the scale. When you get to the dark tones, there just isn't as much detail there, as much information, okay, in the file. So if you underexpose, you're missing the opportunity to capture a lot of important detail in the scene. So your goal should be capture as much detail by exposing the image as much as high an exposure as you can get, okay, without blowing out the highlights. So if you've done a good job with your raw file and you bring it into Lightroom and you look at it and it looks overly bright and it's flat, you've probably done a good job exposing that image. Some photographers call it exposing to the right. Okay. And it simply means try to get as much information as possible. Get that picture to be as bright as you can without overexposing the highlights. And there's two ways to tell. One is here, the histogram. Okay. Look at the histogram. Okay. The other way, so what I do is I bring it into Lightroom and you just lower the exposure and it looks like this. Okay. Went from that to this. Look at the tones. When you lower the exposure, the colors get richer. They look much more intense. and it's just a better looking photo, but all I did was lower the exposure. I didn't increase the saturation. I didn't change the white balance. I just lowered the exposure. I captured it like this way with the maximum amount of information. It doesn't look good. No, it's a raw file that's easily correctable. You take it into Lightroom or whatever software program you use, and you just lower the exposure. And it looks much better. So how do you alert yourself so you don't blow out the highlights? Well, the first one is the Blinkies. And if you don't have the Blinkies set on your camera, you should. And it looks something like this. This is a snowy scene, and it just screams at you and says, ah, ah, ah. You've blown out the highlights. So you just lower the exposure and you reshoot. Okay. So how many of you have the Blinky set? There we go. I love this. This is first time I've done this polling. Okay. 68%. Oh, only 68% of you said that you have the Blinky set. Okay. So the other, that's 30 out of 44 people. Okay. So for you, 14 people who don't have the Blinky set, I recommend that you, when you're done here, you go into your menu system, and it'll be under the display section, playback section of your menus, and look for the term highlight alert. I don't know any camera that calls it the Blinkies. We just do that commonly. The camera manufacturers call it highlight alert. Turn on, enable the highlight alert, and you'll get this effect. It'll show you, it'll warn you if maybe, okay, your image is overexposed. Now, with a case like this where it's screaming and there's so much area that's over, I would definitely want to reshoot that. If there are just a couple little areas that are overexposed, then you say to yourself, well, what's overexposed? And if it's a lamp, the sun, a glare, a reflection of a light, that's okay. They're acceptable. Okay. They're specular highlights, we call them. And people viewing your picture don't expect the sun to be properly exposed. You can't help it being overexposed. They don't expect a lamppost at night to be properly exposed. It's at least part of the center part. It's bright, it's overexposed. So before you just jump to conclusions, even though you see those Blinkies, analyze it. What's blinking? And say to yourself, is it important? If it's not an important area that you need to see detail in, don't worry about it. Okay. But if it is, then go back and reshoot. Well, when I say reshoot, of course, what do you want to do? Well, you want to decrease, the exposure. But before we get to that, let's look at the histogram again. Let's take this picture and, nice detail in here and in here. Oh, little dark over here. Oh my, that's not good. The sky is blown out. And even if I had a graduated neutral density filter, it wouldn't work here because it's not the right shape. I don't have one that's wedge shaped in the middle. Okay. So if you're not sure, number one, check the Blinkies. Number two, check the histogram. And as you can see from the histogram on the right-hand side over here, okay, right there. Yes, it's overexposed. That's what that tells you. Okay, it's bunched up on the right-hand side. When I look at the histogram on a camera, I very rarely look at anything down here. I don't worry about the shadows. I'm worried about the highlights. I just want to know, are the highlights overexposed? The histogram assures me they are. So the Blinkies are blinking, and you might say, well, maybe it's fooling me. So you go to the histogram and you say, nope, I'm not being fooled. It's overexposed. So I'm sure there. So the question is then, whoops, did something there. How many people? Oh, I have a couple of screens going here, and pardon me just a sec here. Here we go. Okay. How many people know how to quickly view their Instagram? Oh, half of you. Okay. So I'm setting you up here. Can you see what I'm doing? I'm giving you your assignments, although I won't be able to check them. But the things that if you're on the half where you don't know how to check your histogram, then your assignment, is to get the instruction manual out for your camera, or buy the book from David Bush, or go to YouTube and put in, your camera brand specific model and do Blinkies. and find out, or Blinkies and Histogram, and find out, how to do those things. So almost all cameras on the display on the back, once you've taken a picture, you can push a button like the info button and it'll come up. Sometimes you have to hit the info button a couple of times because different screens will come up. They'll toggle through a series of different screens, but one of those probably is going to be a histogram. And just look at the right-hand side. If it's not bunched up, or as they say, skewed in mathematical terms, on the right-hand side, then don't worry about it. You're good to go. Okay. Now, we talked about taking another shot and lowering the exposure. So this is going back to the basics. Okay. But I want to hit everybody, get included here. For most of you, this is just, common knowledge. But when I say lower the exposure, if you're shooting in manual exposure mode, then you either want to shorten the shutter speed. Okay, go from 1/250th of a second to 1/500th of a second. Okay, a shorter shutter speed, or use a smaller aperture, go from f8 to f11. Okay, or lower the ISO, go from 400 to 200 or 100. Okay, that each one of those jumps is one stop. So you're letting less light into the camera, and you're going to prevent those highlights from overexposing. Now, if you're in shutter priority or aperture priority, this used to happen to me. I'd spin the dial and the meter would still be in the middle. I'd say, well, I'm trying to change the shutter speed to let in less light, so I don't overexpose the highlights, but I can't. It always zeroes out. Well, that's because you have it set on shutter priority or aperture priority, and that's the intent of that mode. With shutter priority, you set the shutter speed, and then the camera reads the meter and automatically determines what aperture it needs. So if you change the shutter speed, it'll check the meter and tell you the new aperture that it needs to get a proper exposure. So you have to revert to exposure compensation. So if you don't know how to do exposure compensation on your camera, you can go to a website or go to YouTube and find out how, or check your instruction manual. But you usually end up with a scale like this that looks like it's the exposure meter. And you say, oh, I want to underexpose it a little bit, maybe by one stop. So you just push the exposure compensation button on the back of your camera, spin the dial, and your exposure meter will go to -1. So even if you're on shutter priority or aperture priority, now the camera's going to leave in one less stop of light than it would otherwise. And if that's not enough, take the picture, look at it, and say, oh, it's still overexposed, then go to -2, -3. Okay. But you should be able to quickly access and use your exposure compensation feature. Let's see. Menu page. Okay. Oh, good. 86% of you said that, yes, you know how to use your exposure compensation feature. So for the 6 of you that don't, there's your assignment for you. Find out how to use exposure compensation. It doesn't work in manual, okay, because you're changing the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO, but it works in shutter priority and aperture priority. Okay. Maybe we should just take a breather there. Questions from anybody?
Hey, Dennis.
Yes.
This is Mark Albano.
Hi, Mark.
Got a quick one for you. When you're in manual, your exposure compensation doesn't work, but the meter shows you if you're under or overexposed, right?
Right. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. The exposure meter is your friend. Now, most of you know that I'm very happy with my Canon R6, my new mirrorless camera. And one of the things I'm very happy about is that it has exposure simulation, as all mirrorless cameras do. So with that enabled, I just look on the back of the screen or in the viewfinder, and I can see, oh, it's getting darker. Oh, it's getting brighter. And sorry for you other digital folks who have DSLRs, it doesn't work that way. But
another convert.
Yeah, I am. I am. I have been watching videos and practicing with my camera, and I now am in love with mirrorless. I'm not going back. All right. So yes, to leave in less light. So exposure copy.
Dennis,
That's
hi,
Rich.
Rich Scar.
Yep.
Can I ask if Elaine is still on? I think she is. Her argument, she always uses, she underexposes a lot of her photos. Can she explain again why she does that?
Rich, you're not trying to start an argument here, are you?
You know, I am. Actually, I am. That's my only purpose. Whatever.
Playing the devil's
I made
advocate.
money on doing that in my life.
Yeah. No, go ahead, Elaine. Elaine, do you want to respond to that?
I would be happy to respond to that for a couple of reasons. Number one, for whatever reason, I end up shooting in harsh light a lot. So it's very difficult for me to expose to the right without blowing out the highlights.
Yes.
I often will also shoot with auto ISO. Now in my cameras, exposure compensation does work in manual mode if you're shooting in auto ISO because it will adjust the ISO accordingly.
Ah, very good.
So that's usually the case when I would shoot like a -0.3 or -0.7. I seldom compensate lower than that, just because when you are shooting in harsh light, if you lower it too much, the shadows can be a little bit too dark, obviously. But I just am the type of person also that I tend to shoot dark and moody shots. So I'm not as concerned about losing the detail in the shadows as I am blowing out the highlights.
Yeah, I too am I tend toward dark and moody, but I do that in post. I just lower the exposure in post. Now, I'll admit, okay, I'm a practical person. And when I'm traveling, especially with my wife, and there's a lot to shoot, lot to photograph, and I got all this equipment, I'm shooting, I don't take the time to check my histogram. And the Blinkies, yes, but I don't take the time to check the histogram for every image. If I'm out at Bryce Canyon and the light's not changing, I can gauge the light. And I said, oh, let's say I'm shooting on shutter priority. I say, oh, I should underexpose the image by about a stop, okay, to protect those highlights. I'll just leave it that way. And that's the way I'll shoot for the next 2 hours or hour, or until the light changes or a cloud comes overhead or I go into the canyon. Okay. When the light conditions change, yes, then I'll reevaluate. But if the light doesn't change, then yeah, just make that adjustment and go for it. Okay. Is that good, Rich? Or you want to stir something else up?
You know, it's nice. Yeah, I got an education. Thank you both.
Right. And you got to be practical about this stuff. I mean, theory is you could do this and you could do that if you had the time and the wherewithal, but the practicality of the situation is, oh crap, just underexposed by 2/3 of a stop and go for it.
Dennis?
Yes.
Tom Neville.
Yes,
I just
Tom.
wanted to back up something Elaine said. I shoot in a mode I call semi-manual, which is I pick the aperture and the shutter speed and I shoot auto ISO. And on both my mirrorless and DSLR Nikons, the exposure compensation does work really well.
Thank you. I actually had that in the presentation and I took it out to shorten the presentation a little bit, thinking, that won't apply to very many people. But yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Shoot manual with auto ISO, and then the exposure compensation changes the ISO. Very good. Of course, if you're shooting shutter priority, okay, let's think about this a minute. Shutter priority, that means you lock in the shutter speed. If you use exposure compensation, the camera changes the aperture. If you have aperture priority, you're setting the aperture. It's locked in. You use exposure compensation, the camera changes the shutter speed.
All right, I did a little research on that one. If you shoot shutter priority and auto ISO, the next thing that takes priority is your aperture, but you can still override it with exposure compensation.
Now wait a minute. You're shooting aperture priority.
You're shooting shutter priority.
Oh, shutter priority. Okay.
I posed a question and it was, all right, I'm shooting shutter priority. Does aperture take precedence or auto ISO?
Okay.
And the answer was the aperture will change next, and then the ISO will change. So you can use exposure compensation. it's very tedious. I don't do it,
Yeah. Yeah.
but just as a technical point.
Well, these cameras have become so complex. Like you could probably even get into your menu system and you could say, well, I'm going to shoot manual with auto ISO, but I don't want the ISO to go any higher than 1600 as an example. And then at 1600, the camera would switch to changing the aperture. So, and this is all done. I mean, I'm so impressed with the R6 and how complex it is. It's taken me weeks to try to get it to comprehend what's going on. There's so many things that are, in the program, in the menus. Anyway, let's move on, guys. So I set my camera for underexposure because I blew out the sky the last time, right? Okay, on this one. Boom, blew out the sky. So underexpose, and I end up with this. Well, that might be good. Okay. You're saying, oh, look how dark it is here. Those shadows have no detail in. Okay. Well, yeah, that's underexposed then, that part. But the sky looks good. Now, this can be a very effective technique in certain situations. If you're looking at just part of this photo and you want to emphasize, like the peaks here, you could crop that and that would be wonderful. And I have seen photos of well, even take the whole scene or just one spot of bright light, like a beam shining through a window and down onto a floor, and the room's really, really dark. If you take a regular picture of it, the camera's going to try to get detail in the whole scene, and the beam's just going to be overexposed. But if you're really interested in the mystery of that beam, you could grossly underexpose it, like 3 stops or more. And just to have the beam and the spot on the floor, or in this case, the sky, properly exposed, where does that draw the viewer's attention? Boom, right to the peaks there, the pinnacles, and the sky. So this would be an acceptable photo for some people because it accomplishes what they want to accomplish. And it's a technique that I rarely use, but I think about more and more when I look at photos by people like David Duchemin. And he'll show something creative like that, where it's the whole photo is really dark, except for one little area that he's properly exposed, a highlight area properly exposed. So it's very dramatic. But most of us in situations like this are looking for detail in the shadows and in the highlights. So what you really want is a combination of the two. Okay, I want to take those 2 images and I want to somehow combine them together, and I want to get the best of both worlds. I want detail in the highlights in the sky, but I also want detail in the shadows. It's called HDR. Most of you know that already. You shoot both and you bracket, as they say, bracket the exposure, and then you combine them in post. And it is so easy to combine them in Lightroom or in Photoshop or other programs. That's not a problem. The problem is capturing them quickly and easily to begin with. So let's take some time to talk about how you can do that. How can you capture a bracketed sequence of images? Okay. So if you want to let the camera do it, if your camera will, this is the easy way to do it. Look in the menu system, and especially like the mirrorless cameras, they have this. But here's the problem. Well, what they'll do, if you set it on HDR, you can tell how many shots you want it to take. Let's say 3. It'll take 3 shots and it'll give you a composite, combine them together right in the camera, and boom, miraculously you end up just like iPhones do. They do that all the time. Okay. You don't even know it. But because we're thinking high quality end product here, you might end up with a lesser quality product. Your camera, if it does in-camera HDR, probably shoots JPEG files, and the composite then, of course, is a JPEG file. So yes, you'll get an HDR composite, but when you take it into Lightroom and you want to process it, you're limited in what you can do. You go back to the limitations of a JPEG file: limited dynamic range, limited bit depth, and compressed. Okay. So my recommendation is, if your camera shoots raw files and gives you a composite, the combined image as a raw file, go for it. But I don't think, most do. If yours uses JPEG, I say, let's do it some other way. Let's create an automated, let's use the feature in the camera called automatic exposure bracketing, AEB. AEB. The problem with using AEB is that it's buried in the menus and you have to go a couple of different places to find it, to make the settings. And who remembers, and you don't have time, and it's just too frustrating. So the heck with it. But I'm going to show you two different ways that you can resolve those problems. But first of all, let's see how many people, I think we're going to get lower numbers on this one. How many people on our poll? Yeah, 57% said that you know how to do automatic exposure bracketing. Okay, 25 out of 44. Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, but even if you know how to do it, sometimes it's just too frustrating to take the time to do it. So let's look at that. First of all, what you have to go into the menu system and you have to tell the camera a couple of things. So in the Canon camera that I have, you go into this setup mode over here. It looks like a camera, the page here, the orange one. And you tell it how many pictures you want it to take. Now you can do bracketed sequences with, a whole bunch of, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. Yeah. You don't need to take 9 hardly ever, but the typical is 3. Okay. Especially if you're shooting raw files, 3 is fine. Okay. You can tell the camera what order you want it to take them in. Now, what I think is most logical is let's do the underexposure on overexposure. So when I look at them in Lightroom or on the camera, dark, brighter, brightest, they're in sequence. I think default is actually the one that's 0, the one that's the correct exposure, and then -2 and then +2. That confuses me. Can't handle that. So I do -2, 0, +2. As I say, when you look at them in the camera or Lightroom, then it shows up as the darkest, the one that's brighter, and then the brightest one. They're in sequence. And then you also have to go in and you have to tell the camera, do you want it to be ready to do another AEB sequence, or do you want it cancel? So here it says bracketed auto cancel. If that's enabled, then you take one series of 3 shots and boom, the next series will just be 1 picture at a time. Okay. So if you're going to do a series, you're going to keep going, then you want to disable that. You don't want it to cancel. All right. But as I say, you have to go into the menu system. There's one place here for those 3 questions. Then the auto exposure bracketing you set is at another location. So it gets very confusing. So what you can do is you can set up a custom page in your menu, in the menus called My Page. Let's see how many people know how to do that or have done it. Ooh, now we're getting somewhere. Only 9 of you out of 44 have created a My Page. So here's your assignment. Check that out. Okay. Yeah, 80% of you don't have one. In something like this or anything else that's in the menu systems that you have trouble finding, like formatting your memory card. Do you actually go through the menus? You probably know where it is, so it's easy to find, but do you actually wade through the menu system to find format your card, or do you have it someplace where it's easy to get? Well, if you create the My Page, you can put on it whatever things you want, whichever features. Right at the top of my list is format memory card. So when I hit the menu button on the back of the camera, the first thing that pops up is My Page, my menu page. And the first thing there is format the memory card. Boom. What's the next thing? Date and time. What's the next thing? Well, one of them is AEB. Okay. Because when I did it, you register whatever items you want. So you say, okay, create my menu page. Okay. Register features to that page. So then you go through, you wade through the menus. Yeah, and you, oh, there it is. There it is. Number of exposures for automatic, and you can boom, hit that and add it to my page. AEB, add it to my page. Okay. And the things that are hidden in the menu system that you most frequently want to access, you just add them to my menu page and they're right there. Easy access. Almost every camera has this feature. Okay. So if you're not using it, and half of you aren't, then I would recommend, only 80% of you are not using the My Menu page, then your assignment is to check that out and make your life a little easier by creating a My Menu page. All right, there's another way to do it too, which I'll get to. Okay. And did I say allow? Just check the poll here once again. Does your camera allow? Oh, well, 89% of you know that your camera allows you to do that, but only 20% of you have done it. So get on the stick, create a My Menu page. It'll make your life a lot easier. Okay. What's the other way to do it? Oh, well, let's finish up on how do you get the automated exposure bracket? Well, I told the camera, I answered those 3 questions in the menu, right? But now I have to set the AEB. So you go to what looks like what is the exposure meter, and you'll have to find out how to do this specifically for your camera, but this is easier to find in the Canon cameras. It's on the quick access screen. I just push the Q button on the back of the camera and this comes up, and then I spin the main dial at the top to get the brackets and the other dial to adjust where I want them. So what you do is you spin the main dial to spread these markers apart to tell the camera what difference you want. How much difference do you want in the exposures? And if you're shooting raw file, 2 stops is a good difference. That's a very good difference, because that'll give you pretty much, well, you'll have 2 stops and 2 stops. So you have 4 stops between the darkest picture and the brightest picture. And that's usually enough to accommodate. You could make it 3 if you want. Okay, but 2 is usually the recommended difference. So you set it to 2, -2, right on, +2. Okay, and then you're set to go almost. The next thing you want to do is go to burst mode or continuous shooting, the drive mode. You know, the one where you hold down the button, it goes, boop, 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 boop. Okay, because that way you don't have to push the button 3 times. If you hold down the button, it'll automatically dum, 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 take those 3 pictures. The first one will be underexposed by 2 stops. The second one will be an exposure that your camera thinks is correct. And the third picture will be 2 stops overexposed. So dark, right on, bright. But yeah, we all know that correct exposure is not necessarily correct. It's just what they call 0 EV, 0 exposure value. It's what the camera thinks it would be correct. So either you want to have your camera on either manual or aperture priority. Now, the reason, why not shutter priority? Well, with shutter priority, what's going to change? It's going to be the aperture. If the aperture changes, what does that affect? It affects the depth of field. So the depth of field between your 3 pictures is going to be different. So when your software goes to combine them, it's going to have trouble, or the picture's not going to look right. Okay. So that's why you don't do an automatic exposure bracketing sequence in the shutter priority mode. You can, and you might be okay. It might work out all right, but I would recommend going with either manual or aperture priority. Then the shutter speed. If you use either one of these 2, the camera will change the shutter speed. Unless, of course, you're like Tom and Elaine and you have ISO bracketing. Okay, then it'll change the ISO, which could even be better. Okay, but a lot of people don't have that in their camera. So go with manual or aperture priority. You don't want the depth of field to change. And then you set the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO, to get what would be a normal, regular picture properly exposed. So when it takes those 3 pictures, the one that's in the middle is going to be the one that's exposed according to the values you set. The first one's going to be 2 stops under that, and the second one's going to be 2 stops over. But as long as you have the continuous drive set, the burst mode, then you just hold down the button. It's going to go boom, boom, boom. Take your 3 pictures. You got them. You should be good to go. But you want to review them and see how they look. Make sure that you want to, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so what you, yeah, that's just what I was indicating, that the shutter speed will change and it'll give you 2 stops under, right on, 2 stops over. So here's in the chart, here's what you would get. If this is what you had set on your camera, and this is typical of a bright sunny day following the F16 rule that all you old film shooters know about. F16 rule. If you have the shutter speed set at 1/200th of a second, F11, ISO 100, you should be properly exposed on a bright sunny day. Okay. So when you take this bracketed sequence, according to the way we have it set up, 2 stops under is going to be, it's going to change the shutter speed. It's going to be 1/800th of a second, right? Because 1/200th, 2 stops would be, 1 stop would be 1/400th. Another stop is 1/800th. Aperture, ISO, in this case, don't change. Look what happens when you go 2 stops over. You're leaving in more light by letting the shutter open for a longer period of time. Okay, your shutter speed drops down to 1/50th of a second. Ooh, well, guess what? You better be careful. Okay, that's getting to the point where you might have trouble hand holding it. And it is best to use a tripod to get your exposure brackets, but you don't have to. I did plenty of exposure brackets out west, and they were all handheld. You just try to hold the camera as steady as you can. And even if there's a little bit of movement, when Lightroom combines the 3 images, the first thing it does is auto align them. Okay. So it might have to crop off a little bit where they don't line up exactly on the edges, but it'll do that cropping automatically. And you'll just get one image that, where the 3 composited, they match up. Okay. So you can do it handheld, but for best results, use a tripod, and for greater flexibility. Because if, let's say, you walk into that canyon that had the bright sky at the end, it's much darker in the canyon. So you might want to lower your shutter speed. You'd be tempted to lower your shutter speed to maybe less than 1/200th of a second. Well, if you do that, look what's going to happen. The 2 stops under shot is going to be really long, too long to be handheld, because you're going to get camera shake. And that happened to me. I made that mistake. You'll get this will be a blurry image because you can't hold it steady enough. Okay. In case you're wondering, of course, I'm going to send this PDF out. I'm going to send this PowerPoint presentation out to you tomorrow as a PDF. So you have all of the notes. You'll have all of the notes. So if you're down in the canyon, or you're in, let's say you walk into an old cabin and it's much darker in there, but the windows, you don't want to overexpose what's outside in the windows, but you do. So you might have to change your settings. So I would say especially if you're hand holding. If you're doing a tripod, you're okay. If you're hand holding, don't change the shutter speed. Leave it set at 1/200th of a second. And then this is what you'll get when it changes, when it does the under and over. Just go with a larger aperture. Instead of f11, maybe shoot at f8 or f5.6, or increase the ISO from 100 to 400 or 800, whatever, if you need to, because you're in a darker environment. Okay, but be careful. My admonition here is to be careful of that shutter speed, at least if you're hand holding. Okay, because here's what happens. If you change it and you think the correct shutter speed is, I can get this at 1/50th of a second. Well, when it does the sequence, the overexposed shot is going to be at 1/15th of a second. Okay. So keep the shutter speed when you're setting it, keep the shutter speed for the correct exposure at 1/200th. If you're hand holding, change the aperture or the ISO if you need to. Maybe we should break there for a sec. Do you have, let me see. Let me finish up with AEB and then we'll answer questions. and it is starting to get late, so I'll have to assess how far we are here. Look at the overall sequence. Where do I have any? Oh, here we go. You look at the sequence and you say, okay, that pretty well covers it. I've got in the brightest one, see, where's the darkest part of the image? Right here. And on the overexposed image, I can see detail in there. So that this picture will be good to cover that, the darkest part of the scene. Where's the brightest part of the scene? Well, the sky and down in here, I guess. Okay. Well, on the part that's two stops, the picture that's two stops underexposed, I'm okay. I'm okay. I can see detail there. So this sequence is good. It would cover the darkest darks, have some detail in this one, and the brightest brights have some detail here. So when combined, the software should be able to give me a composite that shows detail in the shadows and in the highlights. Should be good. Okay. But if you get in a situation where even this image, if it were real dark in here, even the overexposed image doesn't show detail in the highlights, well, then you'd have to change the whole bracketing sequence. You'd shoot another 3 shots, but here's what you could do. You could, you could apply an exposure compensation to the bracket. So here are your brackets. I was shooting at -2, 0, and +2. Well, you can slide the scale over toward overexposure so you get detail in those darkest shadows. And now you'll be shooting still be shooting 3 shots, but there'll be -1, +1, and +3. Okay, and that's very easy to do. Just spin the dial. You're applying an exposure compensation, to the entire sequence of 3 shots. Okay, let's see here. So you reshoot, check them out, see how they look, see if you're good to go. Now, if you didn't want to do the automated sequence, you can do what I used to do, and that was just do them manually. So I'd meter the scene, hand holding the camera. Then I spin the dial. I put it on aperture priority, spin the dial so it's 2 stops underexposed. And then I'd go, boom, take a picture, spin the dial so it's at 0, the meter's at 0, take another picture, spin the dial so it's at +2, take another picture. Yes, you can do that. That's not an automated exposure bracket. That's a manual exposure bracket. It's just not as convenient. In fact, I did it so often for a while. What I was doing was, when you spin your dial and it clicks, and usually you have 3 stops equal 3 clicks equals 1 stop, and you could feel them. I would just go, boop, 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 boop. Oh, that was about 6 clicks. Oh, I know that's 2 stops. So I'd go boop, 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 6 clicks, shoot again, boop, 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 6 clicks, shoot again. And I'd have my sequence, but it was never exactly 6 clicks. I'd do it fast, and it was okay. One time it's 5, one time it's 4. It's much better to do it the automated way. Okay, so that's the sequence you end up with. And then when you take them into Lightroom, as an example, it's very easy, and I can show you that later, very easy to get Lightroom to combine them into one composite. So this is what I ended up with. Well, kind of. This is what I ended up with after I processed it in Lightroom. And I want to show you at sometime what I did to get it to look this way, because it didn't look nearly this good, even as a composite. The original composite will come out and you'll have highlights in the shadows and in the details, but it'll be flat. Okay, so it's a raw file. It's going to be flat. It's not going to look as good as it could. You might need to adjust some things like the white balance, the black point, the white point, okay, to get a better looking image. Now, I'll take a break here in a minute or we'll end, but here is the easiest, absolute easiest way to do automatic exposure bracketing. Custom modes. Look on your camera's exposure dial where you get manual, bulb, shutter priority and aperture priority program. Okay. If you have a C1 and a C2, maybe even a C3, some only have 2 or 3, 2, not 3. But if you have these Cs, that's a custom mode. This is incredible. What you do is you say, okay, I'm going to set custom mode 3. Let's say this is what I have. I have 3 for automatic exposure bracketing. Okay, so you go through all those things that you needed to set, which is a real pain. Looking through the menus, setting the number of shots, setting the exposure bracketing, -2, +2, blah, 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 burst mode, all those things. Aperture priority or manual. I think manual's the easiest, I think, especially with a mirrorless camera now. But you set all of those. Then you go to the menu that has your custom settings and you go custom 3, C3, boom, register. It remembers all of those settings. What's that mean? Well, that means I go back to regular shooting. I put it on manual and I'm blah, 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 blah. And then I come across a scene where I need exposure bracketing. I go, oh, spin the dial to 3, hold down the button, take your pictures. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to find those in your menu. You don't have to set anything. If you have them all set in advance, the camera remembers all of them. Okay, you take a sequence, you take another sequence, you go back. Okay, now I'm on to a different scene. You go back to manual or shutter priority, aperture priority, and you shoot whatever you were doing. You come across another scene that needs exposure bracketing, spin to C3, shoot, go back. You don't have to change anything else. It's amazing. Now, I have a confession to make. Oh, but before that, let's see how many of you do custom modes. Yeah, and then I'll tell you my confession. Well, we won't do that first. Menu page. Does your camera allow you to create custom modes? 93% said, yes, you are aware that your camera will do that. Out of 44 people, do you know how many of you have set custom modes? 4, if you count me. 4 of us. They are amazing. Now, I know Joe has one set for bear mode in case he's walking around and comes across a bear. He could just switch, right, Joe? Okay.
That's right, Dennis.
And there are others. Yeah, I mean, if you have a special situation, I have one for sports. So if I do daytime sports, I want manual with auto ISO. I want the shutter speed to be like 1/1600th of a second. I want the aperture to be wide open. I want auto ISO. I want the AF points set a certain way. Great. I set it up to go take those shots. I go to custom mode 2. I say register. Boom. It remembers all of them. So I'm shooting some kids playing around in the house or doing something or family portraits and all that. I say, hey, there's a pickup football game outside, in the snow. Boom, I go to C2, I go out and start shooting. And if the conditions are right, if it's a bright sunny day and that I have it set for, and if it's not, then I can make the adjustments. You can change anything once you're in those settings. You can adjust the shutter speed or anything that you want. But then when you go back and then you come back to it, it'll go back to what you had set. It remembers your original settings. There's a way to change things if you need to, but custom modes are wonderful. Now, my confession, I tried these when I was doing weddings and I could never get it set just the way right. And I never really used them. I just did it manually. When I got the mirrorless camera like a month and a half ago, I'm so attuned now to what all it can do. And I want to take advantage of all of its possibilities. That's when I set up the custom settings. So I've only done this for a couple of weeks. So, but I implore you, jump on the bandwagon because it is beautiful. It is beautiful. It was so frustrating going through the menus, trying to find some of those things like automatic exposure bracketing that I never did it because it was just too frustrating. But now C3, baby, C3. All right. Man, it's 8:30 and I'm still going strong. Okay. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. The C3 there. We're just now getting to polarizing filters. So I think it's 8:34. I better end here. If you want, I can continue this at some other time. I have quite a bit more to do, especially if we get into the processing. And I have some good suggestions there. But let's wrap it up for tonight. Let's open it up for questions. Questions or comments?
Janice,
Yeah,
I have
Janice,
one quick question about.
Okay,
the,
Lane, let's go with you first.
with the custom
Yes.
mode. For those of us who have failing memories, how do you remember what each of those modes are set for?
Write it on your hand with a magic marker.
Elaine,
No, a note, you'll remember after a while if you use them a bit, but make a note somewhere. It could be a sticky note or a note with your camera bag. The one thing I did with this new mirrorless camera to become familiar with it, I found a guy on a website who had gone through and made a listing of every menu item. I mean, he went through the menus, just one page after another, listed every menu item. And he put what the name of the function was, what it does, and if what the default setting is, and if he changed it, if he customized it from the default, every one for my particular camera. So I copied that and did that for myself. And there are a bunch of menu items. And what makes it even more fascinating is if you change to like movie mode, then you can do a whole new set of menu items. But I went through all of those, and I say write it down somewhere so you can refer to it. I would put it on an index card and throw it in your bag. But all you need to do is say C1 portraits, C2 action, C3 AEB. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Dennis, on my camera at least, I can actually I can put a name in for each one of those modes.
Oh, cool. What kind of
I don't
camera do you have?
I have one of those Rogue cameras, the Pentax
Pentax.
K70. Yeah.
I've
Yeah, I
heard of
would
them.
think it would be, if it's on a Pentax, I'm sure it's on others as well. If you look
Can't do
around,
that with my Canon, even as new, it's brand new, and I can't do that, but that's cool.
Yeah. And the other comment is, yes, I'm sure others would too. I would like to see you continue this at another point too. This has been excellent.
Well, thanks.
Dennis,
If I may, Dennis,
Yes. Yes, Dick.
I use exposure bracketing with my Nikon DSLR. It's a heck of a lot easier to set up than what you described. And I also use it for my wildlife photography. If you'd like me to talk about that a little bit, I can, but I would need a couple minutes.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how it can be any easier than turning the dial to C3. Once you have that set up, that's as easy as it gets. But yeah, maybe at some time we might be able to do that, Dick. Since we're running late tonight, we better entertain some questions and then close it up. Terry, did you have a question?
yes, who was the guy that you saw on the internet? What was his website? You remember?
No, but I wrote it
okay.
down. I don't remember a lot. I write a lot of stuff down. I'm worse than Elaine, I'm sure. Yeah, I have lots and lots of notes. I can gladly send that to you.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem. Let me make a note of that. Okay, other questions?
Thank you.
Sure. Terry, yeah, it's the list of menu items. Anything else, guys?
How did this is Terry again, how did your 70 to 200 lens work when you were out west? Did you find that you used that a good bit?
Yes. That was before mirrorless, so I was working with my DSLR at that point. But yes, the 70 to 210 was very useful. I really only used two lenses, the 70 to 210 and the 16 to 35. And that combination covered the range that I needed. Well, no, there were some mountain goats. I did use the 100 to 400 for the mountain goats, but for the most of the port, it was those two. And when I get to polarizers, one of the things I wanted to mention was a polarizer is very beneficial for harsh light. And because I only had one polarizer and I was switching lens, I would also have to change the polarizer. And that was a real pain in the gazoo. So as soon as I got home, I ordered a second polarizer from B&H. So at least now I can put one on each lens. And if I'm in a similar situation, I can chain lenses and each lens will have a polarizer on it. But that was in a situation where I was shooting constantly in harsh light, like all the time, and swapping lenses a lot. Okay, anything else?
Dennis, this is Tom Stoddard. One comment question. I didn't hear you mention anything about metering modes. And they can really wreak havoc with all the things that you've discussed as far as setting exposure and overexposing, underexposing. You know, if you've got your camera set on spot meter mode, which I do often because I'm shooting wildlife, and I go out and try to shoot a landscape, I happen to point at a dark spot if I'm focusing on a dark spot in the center of the frame, you know, all my exposures are going to be off. So I just thought it'd be worth mentioning.
Yeah, good point. We all have our own personal habits and our workflows. And I never developed a habit of changing the metering mode. It's a good way to do things if you have the muscle memory to change it. What I do is I shoot almost exclusively on the evaluative mode and use exposure compensation, or change it manually. Okay. But yeah, a metering mode can be a very effective way to do the same thing. Yeah, thanks. Okay, guys, anything else? Okay, tomorrow I'll send out a copy of the PowerPoint, as I said, some links for you, and a link to next week's meeting that hopefully will work as compared to this week. So thanks for joining us tonight. It's been fun. I really enjoyed putting this presentation together. You probably realize that, well, they often said, I taught for a bunch of years, and they often said, you really understand something when you can teach it to someone else. And having to put this presentation together really caused me to organize my thoughts. And I feel like I've learned a lot by preparing for this evening. And we'll look at a time, Joe and I'll talk about a time upcoming that I can do the second part of this. So thank you very much and good night.
Thank you,
Thank
Dennis.
you.
Great
Round of
presentation.
applause.
Excellent.
Much appreciated.
Thank you, Dennis. That was very, very good.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Glad
Excellent.
you liked it.
Dennis, did you get the update for your firmware yet?
Yes, I did. Yeah, installed that the Thursday.
She's putting clothes away, maybe.
Yeah.